They laughed at her inheritance of an old windmill until she opened the hidden chamber beneath it. When the lawyer read the will aloud in that cramped, wood-paneled office in Nijmegen, 3 of Clara Voss's cousins burst out laughing. Not polite laughter, not the nervous kind people use to fill silence. Real, open-mouthed laughter, the kind that echoes off the walls of a room built for solemn occasions. "A windmill," her cousin Bram repeated, wiping his eyes. "He left the estate, the actual money, the house in Arnhem, the antique collection, to us. And he left you a windmill. A crumbling, 300-year-old windmill nobody's touched since the 70s. Clara didn't laugh. She sat very still, staring at the single line in her grandfather Peter's will that named her. "To my granddaughter Clara, I leave De Grauwe Ganzenveer. The mill, the land beneath it, and everything it holds. Everything it holds." At the time, she thought it was just a strange turn of phrase from an old man who loved riddles. She had no idea those 4 words would upend everything she thought she knew about her family, about the war her country had survived, and about the quiet, unassuming grandfather who used to sneak her peppermint candy at Sunday dinners. This is the story of what she found beneath that windmill, and why the people who laughed the loudest would later wish they'd inherited nothing at all. A windmill worth nothing, or so everyone believed. To understand why Clara's inheritance seemed like such a joke, you have to understand what a Dutch windmill actually is by the time it reaches its 3rd century of life. Most people picture windmills the way tourists do. Postcard pretty, sails turning lazily against a blue sky, tulips in the foreground. The reality, especially for a mill that sat unused for 50 years, is closer to a slowly collapsing timber skeleton. De Grauwe Ganzenveer, the Grey Goose Quill, had been built in 1741 as a grain mill, one of thousands constructed across the Dutch lowlands during a period when windmills weren't just picturesque landmarks, but essential industrial machines. Before steam and electricity, a mill like this one was a small factory, using nothing but wind and clever mechanical engineering to grind grain, pump water out of low-lying polders, or saw timber. The Netherlands, a country that literally exists because of feats of hydraulic engineering, owes an enormous debt to these structures. At one point, an estimated 10,000 windmills operated across the country, and it's genuinely difficult to overstate how much of Dutch civilization, the reclaimed land, the food supply, the economy, depended on the ingenuity packed into these wooden towers. But by the time Peter Voss died, De Grauwe Ganzenveer had been decommissioned for decades. The sails, once 40 feet across, had been removed for safety reasons in the 1980s after a storm damaged the framework. The cap, the rotating top section that allowed the sails to face the wind, had seized in place, rusted and immobile. Local zoning records classified the structure as non-operational, structurally compromised. The land it sat on, a soggy half-acre near a drainage canal outside the small town of Elst, was worth perhaps 20,000 euros, and that was being generous. Compare that to what her cousins inherited: liquid assets, a furnished house, a coin collection that a private appraiser later valued at nearly 400,000 euros. It's easy to see why they laughed. On paper, Clara had been handed the family's consolation prize, a pile of splintering wood that the local council had been quietly pressuring the family to demolish for insurance reasons. What none of them understood, what even Clara didn't understand for the first several weeks, was that her grandfather hadn't made a mistake. He'd made a decision, and decisions like that, in families like hers, tend to have histories attached to them that go back much further than anyone in the room that day realized. The first clue. Nobody noticed. Here's something that should have raised eyebrows immediately, if anyone had been paying attention instead of counting their own inheritance. Peter Voss visited that windmill every single week for over 40 years. Rain, snow, his own bypass surgery recovery, it didn't matter. Neighbors in Elst remember seeing his old Volvo parked at the end of the gravel track leading to the mill almost every Sunday afternoon. When people asked him why he bothered with a mill that didn't even turn anymore, he'd give some version of the same answer. It needs looking after. Old things get forgotten if nobody looks after them. At the time, everyone assumed this was simple sentimentality, an old man's attachment to a piece of family history, maybe even a symptom of the kind of stubborn nostalgia that makes people refuse to throw away a dead parent's furniture. Nobody thought to ask a more pointed question. Looking after what, exactly? A mill that doesn't turn, doesn't grind grain, and generates no income doesn't need weekly maintenance visits. Buildings that are simply old get boarded up and left alone. Buildings that are being actively protected, monitored, and maintained are usually protecting something. This is a pattern worth remembering because it shows up again and again in family history mysteries, whether it's a windmill in the Netherlands, or a farmhouse in Poland, or a shop in occupied France. The person who insists on maintaining an otherwise worthless property is very often the last living guardian of a secret they've promised never to reveal by any means other than action. Silence in these situations is a form of protection, but persistent, quiet devotion to a place is a form of confession. Clara didn't piece any of this together immediately. Grief has a way of dulling curiosity. For the first month after the funeral, she simply avoided the mill altogether, letting the county's demolition notices pile up unopened on her kitchen counter. It was only when the local council sent a formal letter warning that the structure would be condemned and torn down within 90 days unless someone intervened that she finally drove out to see what, exactly, she'd inherited. Walking into the mill for the first time. The inside of a working Dutch windmill is a marvel of pre-industrial engineering, and even in its decayed state, de Grauwe Gansenveer still showed the bones of that brilliance. The ground floor held the massive base of the structure. Thick oak beams, some over a foot square, joined using mortise and tenon techniques that predate metal fasteners entirely. Above her, a wooden staircase spiraled up through several floors, each one dedicated to a different stage of the milling process. The stone floor, where two enormous circular grinding stones once crushed wheat between them. The bin floor, where grain was stored before processing. And higher still, the cap, where the massive wooden gears, some of them 6 feet in diameter, carved from single pieces of hardwood, once transferred the rotational energy of the sails down through a vertical shaft to turn the stones below. It's worth pausing on just how sophisticated this mechanism actually is, because it reframes what Clara was walking through. A traditional Dutch mill isn't a simple structure. It's essentially an analog computer for converting wind speed and direction into controlled mechanical work. Millers had to constantly adjust the angle and surface area of the sails based on wind conditions, using canvas sailcloth that could be reefed in or let out like a ship's rigging, all while managing the enormous rotational forces running through wooden gearing that had zero tolerance for error. A single miscalculation could snap gear teeth worth weeks of carving, or worse, cause a runaway mill to catch fire from friction, a disaster common enough that it has its own name in Dutch mill history, Molenbrand. Clara knew none of this walking in. She just saw dust, cobwebs, and the ghost of her grandfather's presence in a folding chair he'd apparently kept set up on the ground floor, facing a section of the stone wall that she would later realize had absolutely no reason to be interesting to look at. Except it did have a reason. She just hadn't found it yet. The detail an appraiser almost missed. Because the county was threatening demolition, Clara hired a structural engineer to assess whether the mill could be saved or whether she should simply let the council tear it down and be rid of the liability. The engineer, a methodical man named Joost Dekker, who specialized in historic Dutch structures, spent an entire day going floor by floor with a moisture meter and a notepad. It was Dekker who noticed the anomaly, almost by accident. Dutch windmills built on soft polder land are typically constructed with a very specific type of foundation. A wide, shallow base designed to distribute weight across unstable, waterlogged soil, since driving deep pilings into reclaimed marshland was often impractical with 18th century technology. When Dekker measured the interior floor space of the ground level against the exterior footprint of the building, using nothing more sophisticated than a laser measuring tool and basic arithmetic, the numbers didn't match. The interior was smaller than it should have been, not by a dramatic amount, roughly 4 feet along one wall, but enough that a professional who spends his career thinking about structural cavities immediately clocked it as significant. In old buildings, unexplained gaps between interior and exterior measurements almost always mean one of two things: either poor original construction, which was unlikely given the mill's otherwise meticulous craftsmanship, or a deliberately concealed space. Someone built a wall in front of a wall, Dekker told her, tapping the section of stone that, coincidentally or not, was exactly where Peter's folding chair had been positioned for the better part of 4 decades. This is the moment where Clara's story shifts from sad inheritance drama into something closer to an archaeological investigation. And it's worth understanding why hidden chambers like this exist at all in Dutch buildings of this era, because the answer connects directly to one of the most remarkable chapters of 20th century history. Why Dutch buildings hide rooms. During the German occupation of the Netherlands from 1940 to 1945, an extraordinary number of ordinary buildings, homes, shops, barns, churches, and yes, windmills, were quietly modified to include concealed spaces. The most famous example in the world is the secret annex where Anne Frank's family hid in Amsterdam. But that case, however well documented, was far from unique. Historians estimate that tens of thousands of Dutch civilians participated in hiding Jewish neighbors, Allied airmen who had been shot down, resistance fighters evading arrest, and young Dutchmen avoiding forced labor conscription to German factories. Windmills, in particular, played a specific and fascinating role in the Dutch resistance that most people outside the Netherlands have never heard of. Because millers needed to constantly adjust their sails based on wind conditions anyway, the position of a windmill's sails became an ingenious, hidden-in-plain-sight signaling system. A miller, sympathetic to the resistance, could set the sails at a particular angle to silently warn neighbors that German patrols were in the area, or set them at a different angle to signal all clear. One specific configuration, stopping the sails just before the vertical position, in what's called the morning position, was traditionally used in Dutch culture to signal a death in the family, and resistance networks co-opted this existing custom to pass warnings without arousing German suspicion, since foreign occupying soldiers had no idea the sail position carried any coded meaning at all. Beyond signaling, the physical structure of a windmill made it genuinely useful for concealment. The multiple floors, thick walls, and complex internal machinery created natural blind spots and awkward, hard-to-search spaces. A search team, unfamiliar with milling mechanisms, might not think to look behind grain storage bins or beneath stone floors, particularly in a building that was still operational, and therefore had legitimate reasons for stacks of sacks, tools, and equipment cluttering every level. Clara didn't know any of this walking into her grandfather's mill. She was about to learn it firsthand. Breaking through. It took 3 days of careful, deliberate work. Decker insisted on documenting everything before they touched a single stone, both for historical preservation reasons and because, as he put it dryly, if this turns out to be a load-bearing wall, we're going to have a much bigger problem than curiosity. When they finally opened a section of the false wall, using hand tools rather than anything that might damage what lay behind it, the space they found wasn't large, roughly 6 feet by 8 feet, with a ceiling low enough that Clara had to duck to enter. But it was clearly built with intention. The walls were lined with the same brick as the mill's original foundation, suggesting whoever constructed the chamber had done so at the same time as, or shortly after, the mill itself was built, or had gone to considerable trouble to match the materials seamlessly, which would have required real skill and real motive. Inside, illuminated by nothing but flashlight beams and dust hanging thick in 30 years of undisturbed air, Clara found what her grandfather had spent 4 decades quietly protecting. There were 3 wooden crates, their lids sealed with wax that had long since cracked and crumbled. There was a small iron stove, clearly never intended for cooking anything elaborate, positioned beneath a narrow ventilation shaft cleverly disguised within the mill's original grain chute. An engineering detail so subtle that even Decker, an expert, hadn't spotted it during his initial survey. There were 2 narrow cots, collapsed and stacked against the wall, the kind of simple folding frames that could be assembled and disassembled quickly, and on a small shelf carved directly into the brick, there was a stack of items that turned this from an interesting structural discovery into something that would change the trajectory of Clara's entire life. A leather journal, several photographs, and a collection of identity papers bearing names that weren't Voss at all. What the journal revealed. The journal belonged to Clara's great-great-grandfather, Hendrik Voss, who had operated the mill during the occupation years. Written in careful, cramped Dutch, the kind of handwriting that suggests someone conserving both ink and paper, the journal documented, in coded but decipherable language, the movement of at least 11 people through that hidden chamber between 1942 and 1944. Hendrik hadn't kept a straightforward diary, because doing so would have been suicidally dangerous if the mill were ever searched. Instead, he'd developed his own private shorthand, referring to the people he sheltered by the type of grain being processed that week, and noting arrivals and departures using dates that corresponded to fictional grinding schedules. It took Clara, working with a historian from the NIOD Institute for War, Holocaust, and Genocide Studies in Amsterdam, several weeks to properly decode the pattern, but once they did, the picture that emerged was staggering. Hendrik Voss, an ordinary miller in a small town, had used his Windmill's sail signaling system and this concealed chamber to shelter Jewish families and downed Allied airmen, moving them along an underground network towards safer hiding places or eventual escape routes, at a time when being caught doing so carried an almost certain death sentence, not just for himself, but for his entire family. The photographs in the chamber showed faces Clara had never seen. A young family, a woman holding an infant, a man in what was unmistakably a partial RAF uniform, smiling awkwardly for a camera despite clearly being in hiding. Someone, presumably Hendrik, had written names and approximate dates on the backs of several photos, likely as a private record he intended to use after the war to try to reconnect with the people he'd helped, or to ensure their story wasn't lost even if he never saw them again. And this is where the story took its most unexpected turn. The letter that explained everything. Tucked into the back pages of the journal was a letter, written not by Hendrik but by Peter, Clara's grandfather, dated nearly 30 years earlier. It was addressed to Clara directly, though clearly written long before he had any idea when or whether she'd ever find it. In the letter, Peter explained that he had discovered the hidden chamber himself as a young man in the 1970s, while doing routine maintenance on the mill his own father had left him. Reading his grandfather's journal for the first time, Peter had been consumed by a mixture of pride and obligation. He'd spent years afterward quietly trying to trace the families Hendrik had sheltered, writing letters, contacting Dutch war archives, and eventually locating descendants of at least 2 of the families, including, remarkably, a granddaughter of the woman in the photograph holding the infant, who by then was living in Toronto and had grown up hearing a fragmented family story about a Dutch miller who had saved her grandmother's life without ever learning his name. Peter had made contact with her, quietly, and the 2 families had maintained a private correspondence for years, a friendship built entirely on an act of courage from a war neither of them had lived through, carried forward by 2 people determined not to let it be forgotten. He'd never told the rest of the Voss family about any of it, worried that turning it into a public family legacy story would cheapen it, or worse, that some relatives might try to monetize or exploit the history for attention. Instead, he'd simply kept visiting the mill every week, maintaining the chamber, preserving the evidence, and waiting for the right person to eventually find it and understand what it meant. He chose Clara specifically, the letter explained, because she was the only grandchild who had ever asked him real questions about the war. Not out of morbid curiosity, but because, as a history teacher, she'd spent her career trying to help students understand that the past isn't an abstraction, that ordinary people make extraordinary choices under extraordinary pressure, and that those choices deserve to be remembered accurately rather than simplified into comfortable myths. What happened after? Clara didn't sell the windmill. She couldn't have, even if she'd wanted to. The moment word got out through the historian at NIOD and eventually through Dutch national media, De Grauwe Gansenveer became something closer to a historical landmark than a piece of private property. The Dutch Cultural Heritage Agency stepped in to help fund a full restoration, not just of the mill's exterior, but of its original milling mechanism, with the hidden chamber preserved exactly as it was found and eventually opened to the public as a small, carefully curated exhibit on the Dutch resistance's use of civilian infrastructure during the occupation. The Toronto family Peter had corresponded with flew to the Netherlands for the mill's rededication ceremony. Standing in the chamber, where her grandmother had once hidden as an infant, the woman, now in her 60s herself, reportedly said very little, choosing instead to simply place her hand against the brick wall for several minutes while everyone around her stayed quiet out of respect. As for the cousins who laughed in that lawyer's office, several of them, according to people who know the family, later admitted they felt genuinely embarrassed once the story became public. Their inheritance, the coin collection, and the house and the liquid assets had certainly been worth more in strict financial terms. But Clara had inherited something that money has never been able to purchase: a direct, physical, undeniable connection to an act of moral courage that had actually changed the course of real human lives, preserved and protected across 4 generations by people who understood, correctly, that some things are worth far more than what they're worth on paper. Clara now runs educational programs out of the restored mill, bringing school groups through the same chamber where people once hid for their lives, teaching them not just about windmill engineering or wartime history in the abstract, but about the specific, deliberate choices ordinary people made. Choices that, as she tells every group that walks through that low wooden doorway, are always available to ordinary people again, in every generation, whenever the moment demands them. The mill that everyone laughed at now draws thousands of visitors a year. But Clara says the number that matters most to her isn't the visitor count. It's 11, the number of lives her family's quiet, unglamorous, unpaid devotion to an worthless old building helped save, one grinding cycle at a time.